Okay, so welcome everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Anjali Thomas, and I'm an associate professor at the Nunn School. And I am very happy today to welcome Alexious Butler. We're very honored to have her here with us today. And Alexious is going to talk to us about USAID and give us an overview of what USAID is and what it does and how it works. And we'll have time at the end for Q&A. Just a little bit about Alexious. She is a career foreign service officer with USAID and currently a development diplomat in residence at Morehouse College. She's had a really interesting and varied career, first with Usaid spanning about 13 years. In 2019, she completed a 4-year assignment in the Haiti mission at USAID, where she initially served as the Democracy, Rights, and Governance, or DRG, Office Chief, and then served as Deputy Mission Director in Haiti, where her portfolio included the offices of Foreign Disaster Assistance, Economic Growth and Agriculture, Food for Peace, and DRG. She's also served as a DRG officer in South Sudan, Bangladesh, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So a really wide range of international experience. And in addition to this, before joining USAID, Alexious has held positions with the National Democratic Institute in Uganda and the National Endowment for Democracy. So really a really interesting background that's very relevant for our current election times as well. And last but not least, my colleagues and I are really proud to share that Alexious is one of us. She's a graduate of Georgia Tech and actually of the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, where she completed her master's degree in 2002. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Alexious, who's going to give us her talk, after which we will have time for questions. And so because this is on Blue Jeans events, the way that Q&A is going to work is that you'll submit your questions or comments using the Q&A function, and then either I will relay them to Alexious or Alexious can respond to them directly from that window. So we are not going to hear you. So over to you, Alexious. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you so much for a thorough introduction. I am going to talk to you guys a little bit today about USAID and my experiences with USAID and how we look at development. So Christopher, can you go to the next slide, please? So our previous administrator, who unfortunately resigned earlier this year, right at the start of the COVID-19 crisis, created a new vision for our agency, which was really looking at how we can work ourselves out of a job and how we can ensure that the countries that we're working in are better able to begin to address their own development challenges. And this is what we call the journey to self-reliance. And the ideas behind the journey to self-reliance aren't really new, but the way in which it's being implemented is new, in that we're taking a much harder look at how we as an agency have inadvertently contributed to development dependency, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, and if not, we can certainly talk about it later on in the Q&A session. Next slide, please. So at USAID, we divide the work that we're doing into basically two silos. One is development assistance, and then the other one is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Now, I should note that that's the historical way in which we've approached it, but we have actually started in the midst of a fairly significant reorg within our agency. Can you guys hear me now? Sorry.
Yes, now we can.
Okay, sorry about that. I've been having some internet issues, and I'll try to go faster so we can get through the presentation and get to the Q&A before it happens again. So, all right, next slide. So, all right, as I said, USAID we are part of the federal government. Well, actually, I don't think I said it, but I'm saying it now. We are part of the federal government, and we are independent. We do take policy guidance from the Secretary of State, but we're not the same as the State Department. They're different agencies and have a different mission. Next slide, please. So, in looking at the history of the agency, it's really interesting to actually take a look at the history of foreign assistance in the US. And one thing that I found really fascinating when I started looking at this was that the US government has actually been providing foreign assistance since 1792. And that assistance has been in various forms. And as you can see here, there's different agencies and plans and ways in which it was actually being done. And so it was taking place, like the military had components, State Department had components, Department of Commerce had components, Department of Agriculture. There was all these different agencies that were involved in foreign assistance. And so under the Kennedy administration, there's a determination that we actually needed to have a holistic approach to how we're approaching this component and how we're looking at it. And that would thus resulted in the creation of the Foreign Assistance Act, which created USAID as well as the Peace Corps at the same time. And the idea, one of the big ideas behind it was this quote here from Kennedy, which essentially says that it's more cost effective to focus on developing partners than it is to ultimately end up addressing issues of conflict and war utilizing the military. So it's just a little interesting tidbit on the background for USAID. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are familiar with the national security structure, I just wanted to kind of show you where USAID fits into the broader development process of the U.S. government. Chris, if you click on the next, you click 2 more times, and there you go, 1 more time. There we go. All right. So you've got the president, then you've got the National Security Council, and the National Security Council includes cabinet secretaries along with the president. Then underneath that, you got what's called the Principals Committee. And that is certain select cabinet secretaries, not every cabinet secretary. And then you've got the Deputies Committee, which is where USAID's administrator tends to participate in meetings at that level. So that would be with the deputy secretaries from various agencies related to the work that we're doing, such as agriculture, state, commerce, etc. And then beneath that, you got what's called the Policy Coordination Committee. So that would be assistant administrators from USAID and assistant secretaries from those other agencies. And then you've got these other subgroups. And I tell you all this so that you know that how intertwined development is in the processes and the workings of the National Security Council and the work that the government is doing writ large. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in those things, one other thing you may be interested in would also be the national security strategy. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what we call the 3 Ds, that includes defense, diplomacy, and development. So you've got DOD, State Department, and USAID. So all of those components will always be represented within the national security strategies. And actually, interestingly, it was Ronald Reagan's administration that was the first one to actually create a strategy that was overwhelming guidance for the government, and particularly for the foreign policy instruments, which those three Ds are part of. If you're looking into the 2017 National Security Strategy to see where it is that we fall, you'll see that, and actually if you take a historical look at the various national security strategies, you'll see that development and humanitarian assistance will take varying roles. So in some administrations, it'll be a much bigger section, and then in other administrations, it'll be much smaller and be incorporated into other sections. In the current national security strategy, development assistance and humanitarian relief is incorporated under Pillar 4, which is advancing America's influence. And so feel free to take a look at those. All of this information is available on the White House's website if you want to take a look at it. Next slide, please. So going back to USAID and how we work and where we work, we are in about 100 countries all over the world. Myself, I have worked in Afghanistan. Well, Anjali already gave you my missions that I've been in, but as you can see, I've been all over the world in the different regions that we work in. Some officers actually choose to stay in one region, so you get officers who are Africanists, you'll get people who are Latin Americanists, or Asian experts, and so they'll stay within those regions. But we have a lot going on all over the world, and there's a lot of different types of components that we're working on. Next slide, please. So again, this is just to give you guys some intro information about how these things all fit in. So most countries that we're in, not all, but most, we sit within the U.S. Embassy. But regardless of whether or not we sit inside the embassy, we are considered part of what's called the country team for the embassy, which is comprised of agency heads and these individuals here. So the chief of mission, which is the ambassador, the deputy chief of mission, the USG agencies, which is where USAID would fit, and then political consular officers, etc. And these are all State Department people, with the exception of this USG agencies you see off to the side here. Now that line to the Deputy Chief of Mission isn't always a straight line. Sometimes it's a dotted line. Sometimes the straight line goes to the ambassador. But this just gives you an idea of kind of where we fit. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you how the USAID mission is usually structured. So Chris, can you take us there? Thank you. So here you've got, so the Chief of Mission for the ambassador is over every U.S. government agency working in that country. So they are the highest civilian representative of the U.S. government in that country, which is that is the ambassador. And then underneath that will be the USAID mission director. And then you've got the deputy mission director, which is the role that I was in my last assignment in Haiti. And then you've got our various offices. And so this is also a typical USAID mission, but it's not standard. Almost every mission that we're in, we will have a health office, because health is 50% of the work that we're doing around the world. And we will almost also have a democracy and governance office. And large part that is because a lot of the challenges that we're dealing with in these countries will be systemic and will require someone that is working on how do you address the systemic governance challenges in the countries in order to improve healthcare, or in order to improve private sector engagement or education or agriculture, et cetera. And so that's one of the reasons that you'll have those two offices in general. The infrastructure and environment office, you may or may not have in each USAID mission. It just really depends on what we're doing. And then the support offices, those will always be in the missions that we have around the world. Next slide, please. So this right here is our new org chart. Remember I told you in the beginning that, we just went through this big reorganization. It's a lot of pieces, and I know it's probably really tiny on your screen. And Christopher and Anjali, feel free to send these slides out to your students and share it with them if you would like to. But I just wanted to give you a sense of like how big our organization is. And so we have regional bureaus, which are those bureaus, like Middle East, Latin America, et cetera. And then we have technical bureaus. So you've got the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs, and you got Conflict, Prevention, and Stabilization, et cetera. And so we've got a lot going on, as I said earlier, and our structures are, honestly, it's a government structure, right? And so it's not always as efficient as we would like it to be, but this is what it is currently. Next slide, please. So now just looking at how we do our job. Our focus is really on the people. So it's on the beneficiary side. So the people who we are helping, it's on the staff. And so we're very informal. I call my supervisor by his first name. I call the administrator by his first name when I interact with them. That's the culture of our agency. In other agencies, you would never get that. You would never refer to the ambassador by their first name unless you are very familiar with them and they'd given you permission to do so. A lot of our staff will come from organizations such as the Peace Corps, or like I did, from an NGO. And for foreign service officers, we'll always have a master's degree, but our civil service officers don't necessarily have to. Most of our staff won't have worked with the military before, but because humanitarian assistance and the work that we do on that side relies heavily on the military for logistics support, and the increasing prevalence of humanitarian crises in the countries that we're working in means that you actually end up working with the military a lot more than you thought you would when you're doing development work. And we manage projects. And so we create a program, let's say as a democracy and governance officer specializing in elections work, I would create a program, an election support program, which was focused on the election commission in the country that we're in, and would go and talk to the election commission to figure out what it is they needed and what it is we could provide as U.S. government. Didn't interfere with the operations of the elections, but actually enhance their ability to be able to do it correctly, and then put that into a project design, and then manage that project when another organization would bid on it, and then once it was awarded to them, I would be the manager of it, making sure that essentially that they're doing what we agreed would be done between the government that we're in and our government. So next slide, please. All right, so this, again, it's just a little bit more information about what I said before. We really do focus, we are very decentralized as far as how we work. And so the mission in the countries that we're in will have the final say, well, not the final say, but they will have a large say in how we're working. So, just keep that in the back of your mind. Let's go on to the next slide. I've got a couple more, and I want to make sure I have enough time for Q&A. All right, so this is our workforce, right? We're not big compared to other agencies within the government. I believe that DOD's workforce numbers are something like 300,000. So ours are 10,000. But what's interesting about our workforce that makes our agency so unique is that almost half of our workforce are what we call foreign service nationals. So these are individuals who are citizens of the countries that we're working in, and they work for us as representatives and project managers, and they provide a level of stability and institutional knowledge, if you will, because as a foreign service officer, my time in that country will usually be from 2 to 4 years. However, those FSNs will, because they live there and this is their home country, they will likely be there for anywhere, from 5 to 10 to 20. And in some cases, we have FSNs that have been with the agency for about 35 years, which is fantastic. I actually just met one the other day who'd been with the agency for 38 years. And so imagine, so those people really keep the projects going and the work that we're doing going, and provide us with that level of reality about what's going on in the country, so that we don't come in and say, all right, we should be doing A, B, C, and D, when we've already done A, B, C, and D 5 years ago. And luckily, the FSNs are there to remember that we've done A, B, C, and D 5 years ago. So now we got to move on to E, F, G, and H. So I just wanted to present that, show you guys that slide for that reason at all. So next slide, please. Which is actually, this next slide is very interesting because a lot of people in the US think that we spend a lot, that we're taking up a large portion of the federal budget. Now, I'm not denying that I think our budget is a good budget for the work that we're doing, and we are well funded, but there are plenty of things that we don't do because we don't have the funding for them. So even though our budget request for FY19 And our budgets run from October 1st to the end of September. And so that budget request was 16.8 billion, but it was less than 1% of the federal budget. And so when you cut foreign assistance money, you actually you're not making as big of an impact on the federal budget as many may think, but the impacts that you have longer term, because we are less able to actually work on addressing problems in a country with a reduced budget, that those impacts could be felt for generations. I'm going to give you the Haiti example. In Haiti, what happened during the 80s and 90s was a significant reduction of foreign assistance to Haiti as the situation in the country was becoming more and more unstable. And what you saw was an increase in illegal migration coming from that country. And so you guys are too young to remember this, but in the 80s and 90s, there was a big problem with what the media dubbed at the time the Haitian boat people, which is really these people that were just so desperate for economic change in their lives would get on a rickety little boat and then take that boat from Haiti to try to get to Miami. And unfortunately, a lot of people died in the process, and the people who actually made it ultimately ended up being deported back to Haiti. And so taking another look at if we can improve the situation in that country, then you reduce the likelihood that individuals are going to want to try to risk their lives, theirs and their families and their children's lives, in order to get to a better situation. So that's part of the idea behind the connection between development assistance and improving the situations in the countries that are partners of ours, and addressing some of the problems and the challenges that we see here in the US. So next slide, please. All right, so I don't think I talked about the spectrum of development earlier, and so I want to give you guys this very academic way of looking at how we do the work that we do. So we've got 4 different kind of streams, right? And so one of them really is that immediate life-saving assistance that we provide under crisis response. And so that crisis can be man-made, it can be natural disasters, and honestly, it can be anywhere. Even in countries that we don't have a development assistance program with, we provide assistance to for humanitarian assistance. And so in these crisis situations, for example, when the Fukushima nuclear reactor situation happened, USAID was on the ground providing assistance to try to help clean it up. And honestly, I think that our humanitarian assistance are really things that we do for the betterment of everyone, including the country that we're in. And so so that's just my little segue on that. Stabilization is an area that we're actually not focusing on as much, and part of that is because the transition and the long-term development components, that is a majority of what we do, right? And so we like looking at macroeconomic stability of the institutions in the country, judicial, political, economic. And then how can we get them to a point where they can start talking about trade openness and financial markets and innovation, and investing in higher education and those types of components. So that's the ultimate goal, is to get those countries there. And oftentimes they'll get tripped up by that crisis response spectrum. And the other thing I wanted to say is that these things are not linear at all. So we could be in countries working very much on long-term development, and then along comes a natural disaster and we got to go to crisis response. And then there's some sort of political crisis that happens, and we're back to transition because the entire government has now been overthrown and there's a new government in place and things are shifting around as policies change, et cetera. And so it's not linear at all. And so we do tend to go in and out of these different phases as we look at development. So if we can go to the next slide, Christopher, I think we're going to talk now about, some development challenges. Yeah. So I already talked a little bit about some of these development challenges. But these are just some of the issues that we look at when we're in countries. food security, which is immediate food assistance, but it's also longer term food assistance, making sure that the countries that we're in, if for whatever reason they're cut off from all the countries around them, that they can feed themselves. On the water side, we look at water for people, but also for agriculture, because you need water for the animals and the crops in order to feed the people. Environmental effects, we look at a lot at ocean levels, rising ocean levels. We look at the effects of deforestation and how we can mitigate that. There's a bunch of different components that go into that, but quite interesting. In Haiti, one of the things that we were looking at was deforestation, and recognizing that there's underlying issues to those deforestation problems. So people are cutting down trees to make it into charcoal because they don't have any other way to make money, because then they're selling the charcoal. They're not using it for their own sake. So we can't just go back and plant trees because they'll just cut them down again. We have to address those underlying issues. Energy, electricity, or access to electricity has been proven to increase a country's economic development goals, economic growth goals. And so how do we provide increased access to electricity in some of these countries? But urbanization. Bangladesh is a country that I like to use in this example, primarily because when I was there, I believe the population was 176 million people, but the size of the country it's smaller than the state of Georgia. And so can you imagine that many people in that small of an area and the challenges that it creates? And I believe this picture is from the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh, actually, which is another story I can talk about later if you guys want. And then on pandemic disease, we are at the forefront of addressing health issues. I told you that we work on 50% of what we do is health related. But we are in the forefront of the COVID-19 response internationally, providing ventilators, PPE, training for the healthcare professionals, and planning so that they can actually address it. But we are also in the forefront of the Ebola crisis, of malaria crises. We're still working on malaria, the eradication of malaria, HIV, AIDS, et cetera. And so we're very engaged in several of these areas. Next slide, please. So I've already talked a little bit about myself as a democracy, human rights, and governance officer, and I've also talked a little bit about these different areas. But these are just to give you an idea of the technical specialties of our staff. And so I, as a democracy, and human rights, and governance officer, I could have worked in another area, but this was the area that I preferred to work in. So most people kind of stay in their backstop through a good chunk of their career. Some do move around. So, but like education officers, I'm always jealous of these guys because they get to hang out with these cute kids all day. And, when I was in Bangladesh, the education officers actually were instrumental in bringing Sesame Street to Bangladesh, which I know it sounds trite, but it was so much fun having those puppets come in and working with them. It was great. And, agriculture, food security, I've talked a little bit about. That involves sometimes working with farmers, sometimes working at the policy level with the government on water users policies or what the broader agriculture policy and priorities are going to be for the country. Economic growth tends to involve working with entrepreneurs where we are. And on the trade side is, okay, what countries are you currently trading with, and what gap is there? Like, where should you be looking for opportunities to increase your trade? And then where else? Global health we've talked about. But yeah, I'll move on to the next slide just so I can get through it because I see we're getting low on time here. So I did want to give you guys a little bit of a peek into how we actually come up with our strategies in country. What we have are called Country Development Cooperation Strategies, the CDCS. And it sounds like a mouthful when you first say it, but you actually get very used to saying it eventually. So every country that we're working in has a CDCS. This is a multi-year overarching development strategy that we sign with the country that we're in. So they know where we're coming from as far as what our strategy is for that country. And they concur with what we're planning to do. And it also usually incorporates like some level of funding So we're doing projection for how much money we think we're going to need in order to implement these specific components. It focuses a lot on impacts and the outcomes, and it also builds, well, it should build on work that has been done thus far to get to the point of where the CDCS takes off. And so incorporating that, these are, you'll see on this chart, there's a list of the different analyses that we tend to run as part of developing this, developing the CDCS. And the entire process, quite honestly, it takes us anywhere from 6 to 9 months to develop it because of all these components, because we want to make sure we're actually being as inclusive and as holistic as possible when we develop these strategies. And on the next slide, if we can go there, I'll show you a sample of one. So is there any way to make that bigger, Chris? Because I don't think people can see it, because I can barely see it. Okay, maybe not. Oh, there we go. All right. So you see the overarching goal of this CDCS from the Philippines is a more stable, prosperous, and well-governed nation. Right, and then underneath it, you've got what's called a development objective. So we've got development objective 1, development objective 2, and 3. Now, each mission or each CDCS will be different. So some CDCSs will have 5 development objectives, some will have 2. So each one is different, and it's all based on what the actual needs and challenges are in the country that we're working in, as well as what are the expertise that USAID is bringing to the table. So if we don't have an education office, for example, we probably won't be focusing on education. However, if education it depends on where education falls as far as the priorities in the country. And so if that is something that the mission decides needs to be focused on, then they would create an education office, etc. But this document here really does guide the work that we do for the period of time that it covers. I said it was multi-year. It can often be 5 years as the average period of time, but sometimes they do get extended up to 7 years. And these documents are adapted as well. So as situations change, you can go back and revise the CDCS and add different components. But you'll see there's like an intermediate, so you've got the development objective, and you've got an intermediate result, which is like, what is it that we're trying to get to underneath this one component, right? So let's say intermediate result 1.2 is education strengthened. So, all right, that's very broad, right? So then you go down to the sub-IRs, and that kind of lays out, all right, this is how we're planning on doing the strengthening education. And so this, again, this is our overarching document in each country. For regional missions, they have a regional development cooperation strategy. And then we also have other strategy documents that we rely on and utilize. But I'm going to stop talking now because I think that's the end of my presentation. Chris, is that the last slide? Oh, this one. Sorry. So just to give you a example of the partners that we have. So when we're in country, we do work very closely with the other donor agencies that are there. Oftentimes, the ones that we find are on the ground will be the British version, which used to be called DFID. I don't know what it's called now because it got absorbed into the Commonwealth Office. But so DFID, Canadians, you'll see a lot, particularly in the Caribbean and Latin America. JICA, which is Japanese, is the Japanese Development Agency. GIZ, which is the German Development Agency. All those folks we work with in the country that we're in. We also work with other U.S. government agencies. So USDA and CDC, we work very closely with them because one is working on health and the other is working on agriculture. 2 big things that USAID does in the field. And we do also work with corporations. And one of the good things about working with various corporations is that they have their own money. And so they're already willing to do a lot of stuff that we have been paying for. And so that makes it better because if Coca-Cola comes in and they're willing to pay for the agriculture program that focuses on development of sugar in that country, then that's awesome because the money we were planning to put into sugar, we can move that over now to focus maybe on working on establishing a road network that goes from the farms to the Coca-Cola factory, or so that the farmers can get their sugar to Coke that much easier. But also along the way, they can sell at the market, etc. So that's just to give you a little sample of that. I've now been talking for probably way longer than I should, so I think that's the last slide. And if there's any questions, yes, there we go. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer your questions. I know it was a lot of information in a short period of time, so feel free to dig in on any specific issues that you would prefer that I talk about, and I'm happy to discuss that or my career or anything along those lines. Oh, damn it.
Great. Thank you so much, Alexious. That was a really fascinating presentation, and yes, a lot of information that's actually really interesting for us. I mean, I think most of the attendees are my students, and we're definitely going to be, digging into a lot of these issues in, or we're in the part where we talk about foreign aid. So this is really, really awesome where we can get this perspective in terms of how it actually works on the ground. So yeah, for Q&A, feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A. There's a panel, I guess, on the side, which you all should see, and there's a button that says Q&A. So if you can just click on that, and we will be able to see your questions. And Alexious, do you want to go ahead and field the questions yourself? And I can just jump in if, you need me to, or if there's a need to, but otherwise, yeah. So I see one question we have already.
Okay, so the question is, has this organization ever received any domestic pushback concerning the number of foreign nationals who are employed and paid with U.S. taxpayer money to work in their own countries? I am not aware of that situation. The Foreign Service nationals that we work with, so just so you know, the State Department also hires Foreign Service nationals. DOD also hires Foreign Service nationals. That is part of how the U.S. government operates internationally. It's just that the number of Foreign Service nationals we have is larger than the others. And the nature of the work that we do really does rely on having that local expertise. And because Foreign Service officers are only there for 2 to 4 years maximum, we need to have that level of institutional memory remain in country as the officers are transitioning out. And if you go to a DOD base overseas, you'll see that a lot of people that work there in the administrative side, as well as on the program side in some of these offices and their bases, will be Foreign Service nationals as well. So we're not the only ones. And the domestic pushback that we have gotten has really been more about the utility of having international development, period. And so it's about the existence of what we're doing and not necessarily how we're doing. Okay, so the next one. From your experience, what would you say is the biggest difference between working for state and USAID? There's a lot of difference. I mean, my observations of State Department work, in particular on the political and the economic side, because those were my counterparts when I was doing democracy and governance work, was that they don't get to spend as much time outside of the office as we do. Because of the nature of what they're doing a lot of reporting back on what's going on in the country and, reporting of meetings that they've had with various officials in the country. Whereas we're out in the field, like I said earlier, the education folks, they get to hang out with kids and, they go to schools and they get to really talk to the beneficiaries. All of us do that as USAID officers. And so you're interacting with the people who are directly benefiting from your work, whereas State Department doesn't have that component because they don't really have they don't have programs like we have that allow them to do that. So that, in my opinion, is probably the biggest difference. The other thing that other folks will certainly mention is that because we're a development agency, we go to the places that need our assistance. Whereas State Department, they get to go to Paris and they get to go to to Geneva and these places for their assignments. In Australia, we don't get to go to those places. And so that's another difference, definitely. but I honestly think that the places that we go to are much more interesting. So that's just my unbiased opinion on the difference. Let's see, what else do we have? Could you go through your career path in more detail? How you started working for USAID, where you started after college? Sure. So as Anjali said, I was at INTA for my master's degree. I did my undergraduate at Duke, and right after I graduated from undergrad, I went to work in DC for a PR firm. They ended up sending me to Uganda, which was someplace I'd never ever wanted to go, and had never really thought about. And I got there and I was just like, oh my God, I love this. I want to do more of this type of stuff. And we were doing civic education on a privatization project, trying to educate people on what privatization was, and so that they can be more informed about what was happening. And so that was, for me, I was just totally sold. And so I came back to Atlanta, which is where I'm from, ended up getting a job at Coca-Cola. For those of you that are from Atlanta, you know you don't quit those jobs at Coca-Cola. And so my mother and my entire family thought I was insane when I applied to grad school. And so I only applied to grad schools in the Atlanta area because, I was a single mother by this point in time. And so I needed to have my family network behind me while I was doing this. So ended up quitting my job. I got an internship at the Carter Center, which confirmed for me that this is the right path. And then I went to school at INTA. And once I graduated, I had already gotten a job, which I think was a bit unusual. People weren't really like, why do you have a job before you graduate? Like, I'd started this job before I graduate, just FYI. And I was working at the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a quasi-government organization. They do get funding and a congressional line item, but they report on an annual basis after the fact what they did with the money. And that was a great job providing working with civil society in Africa, the civil society organizations that were working on democracy and political issues, right? But I really wanted to be in the field. And so then I moved over to NDI, which Anjali talked about earlier. And then once I was in Uganda with NDI, I was recruited to USAID. So it wasn't a straight path. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't really think working for the government was going to be for me, but it's been 14 years and I guess it's working. So, but it's a thing that I wish I'd known about sooner. And honestly, I wish I'd taken advantage of working with a career counselor at the Sam Nunn School, et cetera, while I was there, because I may have actually made that leap to USAID sooner than I did. But you guys have the advantage of now having all this information. Next question. How does USAID engage in countries that desperately need help, but whose governments have a hostile relationship with ours? For example, do we have projects in Cuba? So USAID does not currently have projects in Cuba. I actually will use the Venezuela example because this is one that has been more recent and may have been in the news. So when the whole crisis, the political crisis in Venezuela broke out, God, I want to say, was that like 2 years ago? And at one point you had two different governments in Venezuela. So you had the Speaker of the House, and then you had the president, who there was question about the legitimacy of the election and whether or not he was actually president. The Speaker was trying to take office and was creating another government structure, et cetera. And so as part of that, they kicked out USAID. The person who was saying that they were president, kicked out USAID. And but then at the same time, they cut off all international engagement to the country. So and that honestly created a mass migration of Venezuelans trying to leave the country. So what we did is that we actually set up assistance posts in the border areas around Venezuela to provide them with assistance as they were leaving. So at least their lives in the short term would be improved, so they wouldn't starve, so they wouldn't freeze, so they have clothing and some sort of shelter. And so that's kind of like how we address the Venezuela issue. It's really tough, though, to go into a country where they don't want you. Now, we have relationships in some countries that are, I mean, they're not the friendliest, but they haven't kicked us out of the country. Zimbabwe is an example under the Mugabe regime. We were in Zimbabwe the whole time, and he couldn't stand the work that we were doing because a lot of the work that we were doing was like people like me, democracy and governance officers, who were saying we need to have more transparent processes in place, and we need to make sure that the systems are working, and that you're not operating outside the Constitution, those types of things. But so we don't get kicked out of a lot of countries. The only countries that we've been kicked out of where we were previously and we had a presence that I'm aware of is Russia and Venezuela. In Cuba, there was a move under the Obama administration once the embassy was reopened to look at providing development assistance to Cuba, but that has since been walked back significantly, and I'm not sure where it stands right now. So hopefully that answered that question. Let's see, next question from Tanner. In your opinion, is a master's degree absolutely essential to have a job in the federal government such as yours, or is it simply an added benefit to make you more competitive? Well, yeah, from my perspective, when I was in Uganda, I realized that everybody that was working there had a master's. And so I knew that even though I'd gotten this job, it was really kind of a fluke. And that in order for me to get another job like that I would actually have to go back to grad school. And particularly because my undergraduate degree was in political science, right, which is a little bit broad. And so you want to try to focus a little bit more if you can in your master's degree. But for foreign service, you have to have a master's degree with USAID. That's a requirement. For State Department foreign service, you do not have to have a master's degree. I don't think you even have to have an undergraduate degree for State Department foreign service. But I think it is a value added, and I certainly encourage people to take a look at it because it does give you a different perspective on what it is you want to do with that degree and how you want to utilize it going forward. What advice do you have for college students that want to work in the development sector? So the advice that I usually give is to get engaged in what's going on. Read the news, start reading Foreign Policy Magazine, Foreign Affairs Journal. There's different news outlets that have a big focus on what's happening in the world outside of the US, so you can stay up to speed on those types of things. And to get engaged with different organizations that are having events on development topics. The Carter Center tends to host different events. There was, at least when I was in school, there was an international affairs society or something in Atlanta. I don't know if it's still around, that would host events. But now in this virtual era, all the events that are going on in DC are online. And so you can subscribe to different events from, I talked about National Endowment of Democracy, which is the organization I work for. They have different events online. National Democratic Institute, another organization I work for, has events online. The Center for Strategic International Studies has events online. There's a lot of different things that I would encourage you to do in that sense. And then I would also suggest that you look at doing some sort of study abroad or some sort of engagement in an international project, because that will just completely open your mind to the possibilities and the types of things that could be done. So those are just some examples, and I'm sure there are more, but those are some things I would say just off the bat. Next, let's see. All right. So next question is, to some degree, are the goals and recipients of USAID's aid programs ever influenced more by the federal government's political and economic interests than genuine humanitarian concern? Yes, I would definitely say so, because the work that we do is part of the US government's foreign policy. And as much as it is also helpful to the countries that we're working in, it's because we're there because we're implementing U.S. foreign policy. And so there have been, so sometimes there will be a program or initiative that we think is important that the host country really just doesn't want. In the Uganda example, we had a human rights program that looked at broad level human rights and representation, incorporating LGBTIQ issues, right? The government of Uganda was in the process of passing a law that would outlaw homosexuality. So the US took a position that this was counter to our goals and our values, and that if the government of Uganda wanted to pass that law, then we were going to cut all development assistance to the country. So in that situation, the government of Uganda backed down, didn't pass the law. We continued our international assistance. So that's an example of where, you know, the federal government came in and really backed up the development side of the house. There have been other situations where there's a determination that we were going to have to cut our programming, and there was a sense that perhaps that wasn't in the best development interests of the country. One I can give is under the trafficking persons annual ranking. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but the department puts together every year ranking of countries around the world as far as trafficking in persons and how they've done. And so if you're on tier 1, then you're doing fine. If you're on tier 2, you've got some issues, but you're okay. If you're on tier 3, it's like the worst of the worst. And then there's like middle groups like watch list, etc. So if you start slipping down the tiers, and I was in Bangladesh at the time, and Bangladesh had been ranked tier 3 for, I would think it was 3 years in a row, which according to US legislation warrants an automatic suspension of all development assistance. However, India, which was a neighboring country, had been granted tier 1 status. And we were just really confused as to how that happened, given that all the information that was presented, they should have been on the same level, right? And the rationale that was given was that India was financially, economically more important for a U.S. perspective than Bangladesh was. So, and so we were able to push back on suspension and to get a waiver put in place and then work with the government of Bangladesh so that they could actually improve their rankings for the next year. But those are situations where you see that decisions are happening at a level well above us. And, going back to that national security strategy, that National Security Council chart that I showed you guys, decisions are happening at that level, and we're down here on the ground implementing them. And honestly, you just have to remind yourself that this is the US government, right? And so not all the decisions that are made by the government we're going to like, but we are required to implement them. And so that's what I would answer to that one. And I don't know if there's any other questions. Hopefully that answers your question. You're on mute, Anja.
Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, so I actually wanted to jump in just in the little time we have left. So I wanted to see if you could tell us a little bit more about, some experiences. So maybe your biggest challenges in the field, your most, the successes that, maybe really surprised you. Just sort of, a sense of what kinds of sectors are easiest to work in, what are the most difficult ones,
okay.
based on
every sector is difficult. But and the reason I say that is because it all depends on the people that you're interacting with on the other side, right? So if education is one that I talked about before. So that sector, sorry, my dog, it's like twilight hour for my dog. But the education sector, if the education minister is not engaged in the work that we're trying to do in that country, it makes it almost impossible to get any activity moving forward. Because we don't, oh geez, sorry, he sees another dog going down the street. But so if you don't have the buy-in from the host country government, then it becomes super challenging. And even if you get that buy-in from the top level of the government, the others down lower may not be super engaged. But I mean, I've done some really fun things. One project that I had in Bangladesh that I loved was we did a regional conference, a Southeast Asian Women's Parliamentarian Conference. Because Bangladesh, which a lot of people don't realize, has had a female head of state since the 70s. And so recognizing that Bangladesh is actually setting the trend in a lot of ways, how can we highlight that and also bring in women from the region who are also had never actually met with each other? And so we had women, we had MPs coming from Sri Lanka, from India, from Pakistan, and it was awesome. And they loved it. And then they all agreed to actually, during that time, they agreed to put out a joint statement from all of their parliaments regarding violence in women, because this is right when there had been a situation where there had been targeting of not Malala, but there was another situation similar to that had happened in Pakistan. And so they put out a statement about that. And then they started putting out other statements about the importance of, women and girl education and how you can do that. And so it was great because we were able to be the catalyst for bringing them together in a way that nobody else would have done before, right? And so that was awesome. And, I've had some challenges too. Like I was in South Sudan when the Civil War broke out. I mean, we were literally sitting right there while it's happening. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, there was like gunshots that going off. But at the time, it was Juba. And so you often heard gunshots. And so nobody really thought much about it until about 6 o'clock in the morning, and it's still going on. And then we were locked down, and we're seeing this happening just outside the embassy walls. And, I remember going out on my balcony at our residence and seeing a tank come down the street. And I was like, well, where's a tank? What do they need a tank for? And then there was other curious people who were actually out on the street who wanted to go and see the tank. And the tank started shooting at the people. And so it was just horrifying that this moment that you're actually watching this war, like it's really a war that is breaking out in front of you. So that was heartbreaking, I would say, because South Sudan at the time had so much potential and there was so much optimism for what was going to happen in that country that it really, really kind of pushed everything back that we had been doing. So that was definitely a challenge. And unfortunately, we have a lot of those situations where a crisis comes up. Remember when I was talking about the spectrum? A crisis comes up and completely derails our development approach. And so we have to address the crisis and then revise our development approach or figure out if we can just get back on track to develop approach. And so it's never boring. Let me just say that in our world. Looks like we got one more question. So the level of collaboration on the part of local government and normal citizens varies from case to case. Yes, in every country and in every sector is going to vary. So in some countries, let's say, I generally, when I was working as democracy and governance officer, I usually had a very good luck with having good counterparts from the local government, from the host country government. But others were having challenges. And so our food security folks had worked on do you guys remember the triangle, the food triangle that USDA does? It's got meat up at the top and then different grains and things showing you how much you're supposed to eat. So they were trying to introduce something similar and had gotten all the way up to the Minister of Health, who was the one that was supposed to approve it. And he didn't like that it was raw meat that was shown and wanted us to go back and put a picture of cooked meat. And we're like, well, how do we depict that in a pictogram? So you have little squiggly lines above the chicken to show that it's hot. So those types of things threw back, and but kept giving us different excuses for why he couldn't provide the ultimate approval for the triangle. And in that situation, we actually had to go to the president, and we're like, sorry to bring this to you, and it may seem like a very trivial issue, but it is holding up our entire program, and how do we get around it? So oftentimes, whenever there's opposition, you just have to move up to the next level. if you can't resolve it yourself. And then if that doesn't work, that's when you bring in the ambassador, and the ambassador takes it to the president. But that usually, you don't want it to be the food triangle. It's got to be something much more significant, right? Like all of the immunizations were stolen at the port, and we think they were stolen by government officials, which does happen. And so you have to address those issues as well. But like I said, you don't want to take it to the president unless you can avoid it. So unless you have absolutely no other choice. So there. So hopefully that answers your question. You're still on mute.
I was having network issues, so I was on.
Oh, okay.
I was trying to unmute myself, but sorry about that. So just one more question, unless we have something from the audience. Okay, no. So I was curious, to go back when you kind of presented your, kind of the country developed CDCS, sort of how that strategy is decided and how the development objectives are decided. I mean, what level of collaboration with the host government, and kind of how does all of that work?
Okay, so the CDCS, one of the reasons that is called the cooperation in there is because we have to go out to stakeholders in order to get their buy-in to this process. It is not designed to be put together in a bubble, which honestly was kind of how we have been doing our strategies before, right? And so this is, all part of that journey of self-reliance is making sure that we're being inclusive so that others know what we're doing. And for the process, what we do, like I said, we do all of those assessments. I think there was like that list I had was maybe like 9 or 10 different assessments that we do: gender, environment, political economy, et cetera. And then go through those and try to figure out like what are the issues that have been addressed in those assessments, and how does it fit into what we can actionably influence from the USAID side, right? And then you go through and you develop those development objectives, and you try to break it down into the intermediate results and the sub IRs as much as you can. Then after we've done that part of it, so throughout that you should still be talking to the government. So each kind of lead on those development objectives will continue talking to the government, but then we do a presentation to stakeholders, which will usually be civil society organizations, political parties, our implementing partners. Will have meetings with them. The government will have a separate meeting with the government. We try to invite the entire government so that everybody, not just the ministers and the head of government, everybody within the government who wants to come and see what it is we're looking at doing can come and provide input. And so those workshops are usually a day long, because we want to make sure that you actually have time to really dig into the nuances that are underneath that strategy and provide us with some feedback. And sometimes what we've heard is, you guys have no idea what you're doing. This is not the right approach, right? So we're like, okay, let's go back to the drawing board and let's start all over. Tell us where we're missing the mark and what we need to do in order to get it right. And so, like I said before, it required that the host country concurs with the strategy. So they are involved in the process. Now, unfortunately, one of the things I've seen in my experience is that people don't read it in the level of detail that you would like them to, or even worse, there's a change of government and the people coming in aren't as familiar with it as the people who sat through all those processes. And so what we try to do is like provide some level of information on what it is and what it says, and we'll do a one-on-one sit down sometimes with our counterparts that have changed to update them on where things are. And and sometimes they don't like things that were done by their predecessors, and they want to completely wipe out everything that their predecessors approved. And we're like, sorry, our program, you can't change it significantly now that it's been signed. But what we can do is to see how we can incorporate your concerns into what we're already doing. So we try to be inclusive, and we try to be collaborative along the way. There's one last question.
Time for one last question, because we're almost out of time.
So how has working for USAID affected the rest of your life/work-life balance? For instance, do you still see your family and friends from the US with any frequency, or are you fully committed to your work 24/7? Well, so as a Foreign Service officer, you are expected to spend the majority of your career living and working overseas. That does create challenges when it comes to your family back in the States. And honestly, for me, the hardest thing was recognizing that I was no longer that, how do I put it? You become, because you're no longer a daily part of their lives, you you start getting those like updates and the text messages and the calls, even though now, you got email, you got phone, you got WhatsApp, everything, they can still stay in touch. I'm back in Atlanta now for my domestic tour because every 12 years we're required to come back to the States to do a domestic tour. Once I'm done with this assignment here in Atlanta, I'll be expected to go back out to the field. But even now that I'm back, I still have a hard time trying to get my family to like call. Like, and the other day I called my cousin and she was like, "Oh, you're still here." It's like, I told you I'm going to be here for 2 years, because they're now used to me coming in and out, right? But the U.S. does provide you with a certain number of vacations every year. So you get a ticket from where you're living back to the U.S. or anywhere in the world if you don't want to come back to the U.S. at least once a year. And then every 3 years, every 2 to 3 years, you get home leave, which is basically vacation that they give you just to go back home and reacquaint yourself with your friends and family. So there's that. But honestly, when you're in the field, you do spend a lot of time working. And so you have to like really set your own boundaries for what's going to be your work-life balance. For me, I decided I'm going to go to yoga 3 times a week, which means I'm going to leave work at 5 o'clock because my yoga class starts at 5:30. I'm out of here. Don't call me because I'm in yoga. So from 5:30 to 6:30, I'm not going to be answering the phone either. And so for me, that was a great way to kind of like to let go and to relax, and also to check out in a way that like everybody knew like they're not going to be able to reach me even if they want to reach me, right? And so you have to like figure out what those limits are and where you want to go with it. But it is very easy to get burned out in this profession because, as I said, it's never boring. There's always something going on and you want to help, and you can see, oftentimes you're like, I can see the solution to this problem. But if you did it at 7 o'clock that night, or if you waited to the next morning, would it really, like, what's the difference? And so that's where you have to make the decision, right, for yourself. So I've had to learn that lesson the hard way because I was definitely that person who would stay until 7 o'clock at night every night, be the only one there, and then be very, very tired and spend my whole weekends just sleeping. And so once I focused on that balance, life got a lot better.
Okay, great. You can hear me now. Okay, I'm unmuted. And yeah, so this was a great, great presentation, and love the questions and discussion. I mean, really, we covered the range of everything from your personal experiences to kind of a higher level overview. So thank you so much for joining us and being a part of telling us what USAID does and giving us a flavor of what it's like on the ground. So really, we really appreciate you being here.
So can I also just offer, I'm going to put my email address in the chat. And so if anyone wants to get in touch with me about careers at USAID or the work, please feel free to do so. I'm happy to talk to you offline about anything that you're interested in regarding the agency.
That's super generous, Alexious. And I will, for those of you in my class, I'll put it on Canvas, our course Canvas page as well. So for anyone who wants that as a reference, they can have that. But thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining, and have a great night.